Imagine a love so intense, it spirals into something unthinkable. A seemingly perfect marriage shatters in the blink of an eye, leaving only horror and regret behind. What pushes a man to the breaking point? How does one moment of anger turn into a lifetime of consequences? Stay tuned to uncover the shocking truth behind a husband's obsession and a wife's tragic fate. The bathroom was cold. The tiles felt slick under his bare feet. Steam rose from the tub, clinging to the walls. She was humming softly, unaware. The water rippled as she adjusted, her skin gleaming under the dim light. His hand trembled. He clutched the knife tighter, the blade glinting briefly. She turned, her face glowing with trust. The hum stopped. "You're quiet," she said, smiling. He didn't respond. A bead of sweat ran down his temple, sliding to his jaw. The room smelled of lavender and something metallic. The knife shook in his hand. Her voice broke the silence. "Are you okay?" she asked, leaning forward, water sloshing. Her wet hair clung to her face, framing her soft features. He swallowed hard, the sound audible. "Yes," he whispered, barely audible. The faucet dripped, a steady, relentless rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. The blade glinted again as he raised it higher. Her laughter broke through, nervous now. "Why are you acting so strange?" she said, her voice uneven. Her fingers gripped the edge of the tub. His vision blurred for a moment, the world narrowing to her wide eyes. Then a crash. The knife fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. He stumbled back, gasping, his head spinning. Her scream pierced the silence. She lunged for the knife, her wet hands slipping on the tile. His panic surged. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her back into the water. It splashed everywhere, soaking his clothes. Her struggle was desperate, water churning around her. "Stop," she screamed, her voice breaking into sobs. His grip tightened, his knuckles white. She clawed at his arms, her nails raking his skin. The lavender scent was drowned out by the sharp tang of fear. He pushed her under, his breath ragged. Her legs thrashed, sending ripples against the porcelain. The light above flickered. Her movements slowed. Her fingers stopped clawing. The room grew still, save for his gasping breath. The faucet dripped. Drip, drip, drip. His hands were trembling. They were wet, but not just from the water. A faint red streak swirled in the tub, mixing with the lavender. He stared at it, mesmerized, as it spread like a slow-moving shadow. The knife lay on the floor, just out of reach. Its blade gleamed, untouched but accusing. He couldn't look at her. Not directly. Her arm hung limply over the side of the tub, water dripping from her fingertips. Drip, drip, drip. The sound echoed in his skull, louder with every beat of his heart. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out. But it was everywhere. The faucet. The water. Her. A faint buzz filled his ears, like static from a broken radio. He rocked forward, staring at the tiles, tracing the grout lines with his eyes. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. The steam clung to his skin, hot and sticky, mingling with the cold sweat running down his back. The smell was overwhelming. Lavender. Metal. Something else, something sour and wrong. His stomach churned. He lurched his feet, stumbling toward the door. His hand reached for the handle but stopped. He couldn't leave. Not yet. Not like this. He turned back, his eyes darting around the room. The towel rack. The mirror. The soap dish. Everything looked normal, untouched. Except for her. Her stillness was unbearable. A fly buzzed near the window, its tiny wings flickering in the dim light. The sound was sharp, invasive, breaking the heavy silence. He slapped at it blindly, his hand colliding with the wall. The impact left a smear, faint but visible. Red. His breath hitched as he stared at it. The reality of what he'd done crashed over him, suffocating and absolute. He turned to her again, his voice breaking in a whisper. I didn't mean... The words stuck in his throat, hollow and meaningless. She didn't answer. The fly landed on her arm. He couldn't move. He couldn't move. The fly crawled along her damp skin, its tiny legs tracing lines that didn't matter anymore. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as he watched. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching into corners they hadn't before. The overhead light flickered again, a faint hum vibrating through the air. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself forward, inching toward the tub. The water was murky now, lavender bubbles completely gone, replaced by streaks of pale crimson. The surface reflected a distorted version of himself, wild eyes, damp hair clinging to his forehead, and trembling lips. He knelt by the tub, the cold tiles biting into his knees. Wake up, he muttered, his voice cracking. The words fell flat, swallowed by the heavy air. He reached out, his fingers hovering over her shoulder. The skin was cold, waxy. He jerked his hand back, as if he'd touched fire. A lump rose in his throat, threatening to choke him. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a moment, a flash of rage, of frustration. His mind raced, replaying the last few minutes, trying to rewrite them. If he'd just walked away. If he'd just let her talk. If he'd just... A loud knock shattered his spiraling thoughts. His head snapped toward the bathroom door. 3 sharp raps. Babe. It was a familiar voice. Her sister. The one who always dropped by unannounced. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would break through his chest. Are you guys in there? The voice called, louder this time. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to the door, then back to her lifeless form in the tub. Another knock, more insistent. Hellos. The doorknob rattled. Panic surged through him, paralyzing and electric. He stood abruptly, water sloshing over the edge of the tub and onto the floor. What do I do? He whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. The knocking turned into banging. Open the door. Are you okay? He staggered back, his foot catching on the edge of the bath mat. He slipped, falling hard against the sink. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Hey, I'm calling the police, the voice screamed. His vision blurred, and his pulse roared in his ears. Time felt like it had stopped, but he knew it hadn't. The handle twisted violently. The door was about to open. The door burst open. Her sister stood there, wide-eyed, taking in the scene. The puddle on the floor. The murky, blood-tinged water. The lifeless hand dangling from the edge of the tub. And him, disheveled, wild-eyed, clutching the edge of the sink like a drowning man. Her scream ripped through the air, shrill and primal. It shattered the fragile stillness, reverberating off the tiled walls. What did you do? She shrieked, backing against the doorframe. He couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The lump in his throat swelled, choking him. The single syllable was drowned out by her sobs. She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out her phone. No, he rasped, lunging forward. She stumbled back, her hand shaking as she tried to unlock the screen. Stay away, she screamed, her voice cracking. He froze, his hands raised as if surrendering to her fear. It's not what it looks like, he blurted, the words tumbling out in a rush. Her eyes darted to the tub, then back to him. Her face twisted with disbelief, anger, and horror. Not what it looks like, she spat, her voice trembling.
She's dead.
You? She choked on the words, tears streaming down her face. He took a cautious step toward her, his hands trembling. Listen to me, he pleaded. It was an accident. I didn't mean... She didn't let him finish. Her thumb hit the call button and the phone buzzed in her hand. 911. What's your emergency? A calm voice answered on the other end. His heart plummeted. No, 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 he muttered, shaking his head. He lunged again, desperation taking over. Her scream echoed as she dodged, the phone slipping from her grasp. It clattered to the floor, the call still connected. Help. He killed her. He's trying to. She didn't get to finish. His hands closed around her wrist, dragging her away from the phone. Shut up, he hissed, his voice frantic, his grip tightening. Her free hand clawed at him, her nails raking across his face. He winced, the sting sharp, but he didn't let go. The phone crackled with the dispatcher's voice. Ma'am? Are you there? Units are on the way. The sound jolted him. He glanced at the phone, then at her, panic flooding his veins. Red and blue lights flashed outside the bathroom window. The faint wail of sirens grew louder. It was too late. Her eyes locked onto his, defiant even through her tears. You're done, she spat, her voice venomous. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. He was trapped. There was no escape now. The sirens screamed closer, their wails vibrating through the walls. He let go of her wrist, stumbling back like he'd been burned. Her sister wasted no time. She scrambled for the phone, clutching it like a lifeline. Tears streaked her face as she shouted into the receiver. He's here. He killed her. Hurry. He didn't move. His back pressed against the cold bathroom wall, his chest heaving. The flashing lights outside grew brighter, flooding the dim room with red and blue streaks. Shadows danced erratically on the tiles, like phantoms closing in. A heavy pounding came from the front door. Police. Open up. The voice boomed, authoritative and unrelenting. His head snapped toward the sound, heart racing so violently it felt like it would tear through his ribcage. Her sister bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing down the hall. He stood frozen, staring at the tub. The water was still now, her body unmoving beneath the surface. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, suffocating him. He heard the front door splinter open, followed by heavy boots thundering inside. Clear the living room. Move toward the hallway. Voices barked orders, sharp and precise. He felt the vibrations of their steps before he saw them. The first officer appeared in the doorway, gun drawn, eyes scanning the scene. Hands up, the officer shouted, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. His hands rose instinctively, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't mean to. Don't move, another officer ordered, entering behind the first. They swarmed him, their presence overwhelming. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs snap around his wrists, the finality of the click reverberating through his body. Her sister's sobs echoed faintly from the other room. The officers guided him out of the bathroom, their grip firm. As he passed the tub, his eyes lingered on her one last time. The door slammed behind him, and the sound of the sirens outside swallowed everything. The chill of the night air hit him as they dragged him outside. His bare feet scraped against the rough pavement, leaving faint, wet imprints behind. The flashing lights of the police cruisers bathed the scene in a surreal glow. Neighbors gathered on their porches and lawns, their faces blurred by the chaos. Whispers rose like a low hum, indistinct but sharp, slicing through the frigid air. Is that him? Did he really kill her? Unbelievable. He kept his head down, avoiding their stares, but he could feel their eyes on him. Judging. Condemning. The officers shoved him into the back of a cruiser, the leather seat cold against his damp clothes. The door slammed shut with a metallic thud, sealing him inside. For a moment, everything was muffled. Voices, footsteps, the distant wail of another siren. He stared at his reflection in the partition glass. A ghost of himself stared back. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his skin smeared with faint streaks of blood and water. A faint tremor ran through him, his hands still shaking in the cuffs. The car radio crackled, dispatch giving updates he couldn't comprehend. Through the window, he saw her sister standing in the driveway, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. She was speaking to an officer, her words frantic, her hands gesturing toward the house. He turned away, closing his eyes. But he couldn't escape the images in his mind. Her face beneath the water. The lavender bubbles bursting. The silence. A sudden knock on the window startled him. An officer opened the door, his expression unreadable. "You're being transported," he said curtly. They hauled him out of the car, their grips like iron. The world outside felt colder, the air heavier. A second cruiser waited, its engine idling. As they guided him toward it, he glanced back at the house one last time. The bathroom window glowed faintly, the shadows inside still moving as investigators worked. He shuddered, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he knew was coming next. This wasn't just the end of the night. It was the beginning of something far worse. The second cruiser's door swung open with a mechanical squeal. They shoved him inside, the seat colder than the first. The officers slammed the door shut, and the world outside seemed to blur into a haze of flashing lights. He couldn't focus. His thoughts were spinning, spiraling out of control, but he couldn't stop them. His mind kept returning to her face, the way her eyes had looked when she realized what he was doing. The disbelief in her sister's voice as she screamed at him. The coldness of the water. The smell of lavender mingling with the unmistakable metallic scent that clung to the air now. It was all too much. The cruiser began to move, cutting through the streets in a sharp, rhythmic pattern. Each turn felt like another layer of distance between him and the life he had known, the life he had destroyed in those few moments of rage. The sirens had faded, but the unease in his gut didn't. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't return from. The guilt surged again, but it was hollow, too late. The lights blurred past, red and blue streaks merging with the darkness, making everything feel like a dream. But he knew this wasn't a dream. This was his reality now. The car slowed as they approached the station. A cold, foreboding weight settled over him. He was no longer in control. He was a prisoner of his own choices. The cruiser pulled into the parking lot with a sharp turn, the tires screeching against the pavement. The officers led him out and toward the entrance. His legs felt weak, but they kept him moving. The station loomed before him, gray and imposing, a place where the guilty were bound to face their fate. The cold metal doors closed behind him with a finality that rattled his core. Inside, the sterile lights flickered above, casting long shadows across the hallway. They pushed him into a small interrogation room, the walls bare and uninviting. A single metal chair sat in the center, and he was shoved into it, his arms still cuffed to the back. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving him in eerie silence. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. He couldn't tell. His mind was lost in a haze of fragmented memories, distorted images, and an overwhelming sense of regret. He could still hear her voice in his head, the way she had pleaded with him, the way her sister had screamed. The image of her lifeless body in the tub wouldn't leave him. He squeezed his eyes shut, as though he could block it out, but it was no use. The door creaked open again. 2 officers stepped inside, one carrying a clipboard, the other with a stern expression. They sat across from him, the air thick with unspoken questions. "You want to tell us what happened?" the first officer asked, his voice even but firm. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of it all crushed him. Too much to explain, too much to ever fix. Instead, he lowered his head, staring at the floor, where his reflections stared back. The man who had killed her. And now he would face whatever came next. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. He couldn't meet their eyes. The officers waited, their presence heavy. The air in the room felt stale, as if it had been waiting for him to break. But he couldn't speak. Not yet. Every time he tried, the words tangled in his throat, twisting into something he couldn't control. The second officer leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "You're not going to make this easy on yourself, are you?" he said, his voice low but edged with impatience. The words stung, but they didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. All he could hear was her voice, the way it had broken, the way she had begged. Her sister's scream. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push it all away. But it lingered, a shadow on his mind that wouldn't leave. The first officer cleared his throat. "Look, we know what happened. We have the evidence." His words cut through the fog in his mind like a blade. Evidence. The words settled over him, cold and final. The photos. The bloodstains. The witnesses. He had been caught, trapped in a web of his own making. There was no way out. The officer slid a piece of paper across the table toward him. It was a photo. Her face, pale and still, eyes wide open in terror. Her hair clung to her wet skin, the lavender water swirling around her lifeless form. His stomach churned. The picture was a stark reminder of the brutal reality he had created. His hands trembled as he reached for the photo, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it. Instead, he pushed it back across the table, as though it could somehow erase the truth. "I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. "Everyone says that," the second officer replied, his tone flat. He wasn't sure if it was anger or indifference that lingered in the officer's voice. But it didn't matter. The truth was unavoidable now. The door to the interrogation room opened again, and another officer stepped inside. A woman. Her eyes were cold, professional, and she didn't waste any time. "Let's talk about what happened before she ended up in that tub," she said, taking a seat opposite him. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his racing heart. But no words came. The room was spinning again, the weight of everything pressing down on him, suffocating him in its finality. There was no way out. No escaping the consequences. Not anymore. This was his reality. And the only thing left to do was face it. The woman officer's gaze was piercing, but her voice remained steady, calm. "Tell us what happened," she said again, the quiet insistence hanging in the air. He opened his mouth, but it felt like his tongue was made of lead, unable to form any sound. His body was frozen, as though trapped in an invisible cage of guilt and dread. His mind raced, but his thoughts were jumbled, chaotic. Her face kept flashing before him, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and fear. The knife in his hand. The rage. It had come so fast. So violently. And then nothing. Just the cold realization of what he had done. I didn't mean to," he muttered again, his voice shaking with the effort. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. They meant nothing now. The woman leaned forward slightly, her expression unchanging. "Everyone says that. But we need to know. What led up to it?" she asked, her tone still composed but carrying an edge. He swallowed hard, the words finally clawing their way to the surface. "It was just... I don't know. We had been arguing," he started, his voice hoarse. His mind was racing again, trying to piece together the fragments of that night. The tension had built slowly, like a storm on the horizon, and he hadn't been able to control it. "I was so angry." She wouldn't listen. She kept talking, and it just... He broke off, his breathing becoming shallow. The image of her face, terrified, her voice pleading, haunted him like a ghost he couldn't escape. His fists clenched, and he felt the heat of the memory flood through him, his chest tight with regret and confusion. Then, "I snapped," he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. The room felt smaller. The officers remained silent, their eyes on him, waiting. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted her to stop. I didn't mean to do that." His hands were trembling now, his body beginning to shake as the truth dug into him like a splinter. He had done it. He had crossed that line. The woman officer's eyes softened, but only for a brief moment. "You're telling me this happened in a moment of anger?" she asked, her voice gentle but sharp. He nodded, barely able to form the motion. "Yes. I didn't even think. I don't know." He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't explain it. Not in a way that would ever make sense. Not in a way that would make it okay. The officer's expression remained neutral, but she glanced at her partner. They were waiting for something more. For the rest of the story. But there was nothing more to give. He had already said too much, and yet nothing felt like enough. The silence stretched on, each passing second sinking him deeper into the abyss of his actions. And still, all he could hear was her voice, echoing in his head, asking him why. The silence was suffocating, thick and oppressive, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. His mind felt clouded, each thought tangled in knots, impossible to untangle. The officer's eyes bore into him, unyielding, waiting for him to give the missing piece. But he couldn't. There was no way to explain it, no way to make sense of what he had done. It had started as an argument, a fight. Words thrown like weapons, insults sharp and unforgiving. But somewhere, in the chaos of it, something inside him snapped. He felt a sharp pang in his chest, a raw ache that he couldn't name. "I didn't mean to," he whispered again, as if saying it could somehow undo the damage. But the words felt empty. He heard a faint noise from the other room, the sound of footsteps, a door opening, closing. The air around him grew thicker, heavier. He couldn't breathe. The woman officer didn't say anything for a moment. She just watched him, her gaze steady, unwavering. Finally, she spoke again. "You know what's waiting for you, don't you?" Her voice wasn't harsh, but there was a weight to it, an undeniable truth in her words. He nodded, his throat tight. He knew. The realization sank in deeper, spreading through him like a poison, dark and suffocating. The life he had known was gone, shattered beyond repair. The weight of the consequences was now bearing down on him, unrelenting. Her sister's face flashed in his mind, her tear-streaked cheeks, her frantic voice begging for help. The thought of her, standing there, helpless, haunted him even more than his own guilt. He could feel it, her judgment, her anger, her disbelief. And then there was her, the woman he had loved, the woman he had killed. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice breaking. His chest heaved as if the air itself was turning to stone. "I didn't want this to happen," he repeated, the words sounding pathetic, desperate. But the truth was, it had already happened. There was no going back. The officer exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning him. She didn't seem surprised. She had heard this before, over and over. "It's too late for that now," she said, her voice soft but final. The words hit him like a physical blow. He sank back into the chair, his hands still trembling in the cuffs. He didn't even know how to respond. Everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in, had crumbled in an instant. There was no excuse. There was no redemption. There was only the cold, harsh reality of the consequences that awaited him. The door to the interrogation room opened again, and another officer stepped inside. His eyes immediately flicked to the clock on the wall. "It's time," the officer said simply. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air thick with dread. He didn't fight when they stood him up, didn't resist when they led him toward the door. It was over. All that was left was the cold, dark path ahead. They led him down the narrow hallway, the sound of their boots echoing off the sterile walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his actions pressing on him like an anchor. He couldn't look at the officers, couldn't bring himself to meet their eyes. The world outside seemed distant, unreachable, as though it existed in a different time and place. All that mattered now was the door in front of him. The final door. They reached it. A thick metal door, unyielding and cold, standing as the last barrier between him and everything that was about to unfold. He didn't resist when they opened it. The harsh fluorescent lights inside the holding cell flickered above, casting long, unforgiving shadows on the floor. The smell of antiseptic and concrete filled his nose. He didn't think, he simply walked inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a final, resounding sound, and he was alone. Alone with his thoughts, with the weight of what he had done. He sank onto the small, hard bench in the corner of the cell, his hands still shackled to the metal cuffs. His eyes were heavy, but sleep wouldn't come. How could it? There was no escape from this. The reality of the situation felt almost surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Her face was burned into his mind, her eyes wide open in horror, the blood on her skin. He had done that. He had taken her life. The thought churned in his stomach, twisting like a blade. The echoes of her last words seemed to replay in his mind over and over. He could almost hear her pleading with him, begging him to stop. But he hadn't. He had kept going. And now, there was no turning back. The silence in the cell was absolute, suffocating. The only sound was the faint buzz of the lights overhead and the muffled voices from outside the door. But he couldn't focus on that. His mind kept returning to her, to what he had done. The anger, the rage, the way it had all spiraled out of control. A low sob escaped him, barely a whisper in the cold, empty room. His chest tightened, and the tears came, hot and unrelenting. He couldn't hold them back. They spilled down his cheeks, mixing with the guilt and shame that weighed him down. How had it come to this? How had he lost himself so completely? He closed his eyes, trying to escape the vision of her, but it was no use. It was always there, lurking behind his eyelids, a constant reminder of the irreversible damage he had caused. And so, he sat there, alone in the dark, trapped in the cage of his own making. The door would open again soon. But when it did, there would be no answers. Only consequences. The hours dragged on in the cold, dim cell. Time was meaningless here, each second stretching into eternity. He sat still, staring at the bare walls, the light above flickering like a cruel reminder of the world beyond the cell, one that he could no longer be a part of. His mind wandered in circles, replaying the moment over and over. The argument, the rage, the silence after. It had all escalated so fast. He had never intended for any of it to happen. Yet here he was. Her lifeless face was burned into his memory, a permanent scar. And no matter how many times he closed his eyes, he couldn't erase the horror of what he had done. His hands still trembled in the cuffs, as if they could never forget. At some point, a soft click broke through the haze in his mind, the door to the cell opening. He barely looked up, the sound of footsteps coming closer, but his body didn't respond. He had no fight left in him. A voice, firm but not unkind, spoke his name. He blinked, looking up to see an officer standing in the doorway. It was the woman who had questioned him earlier, her eyes steady but distant. "We need to take you in for further processing," she said, her tone neutral, though there was an undercurrent of something he couldn't place. He nodded, his movements slow, as if his body didn't belong to him anymore. They uncuffed him, and he stood, his legs shaky, his body stiff. The weight of what he had done seemed to press down on him with every step he took, each footfall a reminder of his irreversible loss. The officer led him down the narrow hallway once more, the cold, sterile walls closing in. He could hear the distant murmur of voices from the officers in the precinct, but they didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the crushing, suffocating reality that followed him like a shadow. Her face, her voice, the way she had pleaded, those images would never leave him. They had crossed a line that night, a point of no return. And now, there was nothing left but to face the consequences. At the end of the hall, another door opened. This one led to a small room, with no windows. It was a holding room for those who had nowhere to go, for those waiting to be processed into the system. They pushed him inside. And just like that, the door clicked shut behind him. The silence was deafening. All he could hear was the echo of his own heartbeat in the emptiness. The door wouldn't open again until everything was over. And that was when the weight of his actions truly settled in.
There was no way back from this.
Not anymore. The hours blurred into a haze as he sat in the holding room, the cold metal bench pressing against his back. Every breath felt heavy, each inhale a reminder of the life he had thrown away. He couldn't stop replaying her face in his mind, her wide, terrified eyes as he held the knife. It wasn't supposed to end like this, but it had. The officer had left him alone with nothing but his thoughts, the silence stretching out like an abyss. Outside the door, life continued, but inside, he was trapped, both physically and mentally. No amount of regret could undo what he had done. No apology would bring her back. He tried to recall how he had gotten here. The arguments, the petty squabbles. Was that what had led to this? Was that why he had snapped? Or had there been something deeper inside him? Something that he had refused to acknowledge? He closed his eyes, but all he could see was her, lifeless in the tub. The feel of the water, the cold that had followed him even after it was all over. The weight of her death pressed on him, suffocating him with every breath. He had crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. The door to the holding room opened once more, but this time, it wasn't the officer. It was someone else. A familiar face. Her sister. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying, but there was no anger in them. Just a deep, aching sorrow. He couldn't meet her gaze.
How could he?
He had taken away the one person who had meant everything to her. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You took her from me? It wasn't a question. There was no blame in her words, just an acceptance that settled in the air between them. And in that moment, he realized that he couldn't undo the damage. He had destroyed everything. All that was left now was facing what was to come. The door clicked shut behind her, and he was alone once more. The silence was final. His fate was sealed. And all he could do now was wait for the inevitable. The weight of his actions, of the life he had ended, would follow him wherever he went. But there was no escaping it. No escape from the truth. And as the hours ticked by, he finally accepted that there was nothing left for him but the consequences of his choices. And they would be his to bear, forever.